非常感谢刘博士的分享。COP26上面呢所达成的这些国际的相关协议跟倡议，的的确确是需要我们持续的关注。那接下来呢，让我们邀请到苏黎世大学国际气候政策研究中心的 Michaelowa 博士。Michaelowa 博士呢，他是瑞士著名的碳市场的一个专家，曾参与呢国际上呢多个 CDM 方法学的一个创立及审议。同时也是呢 IPCC 呢科学评估报告里面的作者之一。那在今天的论坛里面呢，他也将和我们详细的说明 COP26的里面呢各个国家对于国际碳市场所达成的一个共识，以及我们台湾应该如何参与在国际的碳市场之中。那我们欢迎他。
So thank you very much for the invitation to talk to your colleagues. And of course, I've been friend of Taiwan for many years. I've been giving lectures at the National Taipei University several times since 2010. Actually, I've been able to see the beauty of Taiwan. I went to Xueshan Peak and to Yushan Peak in the best possible conditions. So I see how Taiwan is protecting its nature. It's very, very good. So let me get into the topic. I will first discuss what were the key formal tasks of the COP26, then what were the aim and strategies of the UK presidency of the COP, then, of course, a few external influences on the COP, and then go into the different key fields, the increase of ambition for greenhouse gas mitigation, then the UK side deals, as I would like to call them, finance, which was one of the key topics, and then, of course, the international carbon markets, where we've been able to complete the Paris rulebook. Then the issues that were a bit less successful, so-called loss and damage and adaptation, and some outlook for the future. So, of course, those of you who have followed climate policy know these milestones, but for those who don't do it on the daily basis, I just wanted to recall them, that we now have about 30 years of international climate policy, starting with the UN Framework Convention in 92, followed by the Kyoto Protocol in 97, then the implementation rules for the Kyoto Protocol in the so-called Marrakesh Accords of 2001, then a long period of the Kyoto Protocol preparation implementation and the negotiations for the follow up of the Kyoto Protocol, first failing in Copenhagen in 2009, but then fortunately the train was put back on the rails and achieved the Paris Agreement in 2015. The implementation of the Paris Agreement through the Katowice decisions in 2018, but with some major problems remaining on the market mechanisms, Article 6, on the transparency framework and the so-called common timeframes of the NDCs, and this now being resolved by the Glasgow Climate Pact of 2021. So the key tasks of this COP were manifold. It was a really big COP. You have COPs that only do one or two decisions. Then you have those that have to do many decisions, and the COP26 was one of the latter. So the question how to close the gap of international climate finance, that has now become very clear, and how to start the negotiations about the post-2025 international climate finance target, two very problematic items because developing countries and industrialized countries have very different positions on those issues. Then the issue of mitigation ambition to strengthen the 2030 NDCs, the national climate plans, and to update the long-term strategies for 2050 and beyond. Then in the Paris Agreement, there is mention of a global goal for adaptation, but it has not been operationalized so far. So moving towards that goal, then this question of loss and damage, which is the refunding of impacts of climate change to poor countries. Then the international cooperation, the market mechanisms under Article 6, the reporting tables for the transparency, which of course is crucial in the context of a bottom-up agreement like the Paris Agreement. Then the so-called common timeframes, meaning can the countries just put any time frame for the national climate policy plan, or is there some coordination? and then work programs that are often taken very seriously by the NGOs on education capacity building, which of course is important also for think tanks and the local communities and indigenous people. So that was the formal agenda, and of course there were about 20 minor items, reports of institution A, report of institution B, but these were the main topics. Now, of course, we know that Great Britain has a rather flamboyant prime minister these days. Boris Johnson often talks things ad hoc manner, and this was no difference in the context of the COP. So when US President Biden invited Boris Johnson for the summit in April, he was giving 4 words for what he wanted to achieve: coals, cars, cash, and trees. So phasing out of coal production in the medium to long term, shifting transport to net zero vehicles, mobilizing new finance, and reducing tropical deforestation. And then after this summit, he came up with a 5th initiative that was methane reduction of 30% by 2030, beautiful numbers. And then, of course, within the UK, the industrial policy is quite eager to work on nature-based solutions and carbon capture and storage. So, of course, these were topics that were not necessarily directly linked to the tasks under UNFCCC. So what was the elephant in the room? And I really liked when I came to the venue on one day and there was a plastic elephant standing in the hallway. So I thought, let's get a picture of the elephant in the room. So the key elephants in the room were Article 6, the market mechanisms, then the finance and the transparency. So these were the topics where really negotiations were very intense and everyone felt that this is what needs to be resolved. Then there were 3 smaller elephants: the loss and damage, the updates of the NDCs, and the common timeframes. So surprisingly, because when I booked my plane ticket to Glasgow in September, I was surprised that I got a really very low price. And 1 week later, the flight was sold out. So I was very happy that I did it just in time. And the participation was a record level. So even Paris, Copenhagen, all the famous COPs that we had in the past were much less attended, almost 40,000 people formally registered. And that's all categories, not only government representatives, but also the NGO observers and even the media, the journalists. I was really surprised about the media interest because you would think, well, it's not a major climate treaty which is under negotiation. It's it's the Paris Agreement implementation, so it's rather nitty-gritty stuff, but still the media were there. On one day, the capacity limit of 10,000 people in the venue was reached, and they had to shut off the entrance. And of course, you see also on the upper right-hand side, it led to long queues. On one day, there was 3-hour waiting time if you came at the wrong time. So it showed that people were eager to meet and they wanted to engage in these negotiations. So with regard to the key topic of ambition, what was quite interesting that in the week before the COP started, various Arab countries came with net zero announcements. And the United Arab Emirates for 2050, Saudi Arabia for 2060. And that was really unexpected. I've been working a lot in the Arab world, and if I had been asked 1 year ago whether these countries would be willing to do a net zero target, would have said, no way. It will take many years before they do it. But now they did it, and that was, of course, a good sign, because it meant that other countries would consider, okay, if those countries can do it, we can do it as well. So India came up and Nigeria, all the huge countries, of course, with target dates that are fairly late, but India is a poor country and 2070 is ambitious for India. That one clearly needs to say. So on the graph on the lower left, you see the yellow curve, which gives now the overall emissions pathway as per all the net zero the pledges, and the International Energy Agency has done a calculation which says with all that, and of course also the side pledges, I'll come to those, the world would be on a warming path of 1.8 degrees, which would be the first time that the estimate is below 2 degrees, which is the upper end of the Paris long-term target. Other institutions saying, IEA is too optimistic. They are still dominated by the fossil fuel interests. And for example, the NGOs under the Climate Action Tracker, they think it's only 2.4 degrees, but compared to the 3 degrees and more that we had only 1 year ago, it's a movement. Now, of course, the short term doesn't look as pretty as the long term. So we've seen problems with the NDC updates. They came in slowly only, and also some big countries did not do an update like China. But what was happening in the second week of the conference was really unexpected, because US and mainland China, they did a deal. And they did already a similar deal in 2014, which then enabled the Paris Agreement, because in the 2014 deal, they said, yeah, China will now no longer fight for a bifurcation, meaning a full differentiation between developing countries and industrialized countries. And these were the same politicians negotiating the deal. It was John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua on the mainland side. And the language of the new deal was very similar to the old deal, saying we want this conference to be a success. And we want that the NDC is updated on the Chinese side. And that also said in a bit of a convoluted language, but if one reads it carefully, it says the peaking year of mainland China coal use would be 2025 already, and not only 2030, as was in the previous NDC. And this, of course, is now a very good starting point for the update of the NDC, which I would see as a key result of the COP. In the graphs, you see, of course, the gap between the sum of the current NDCs and 2-degree target or 1.5 degree target compatible emission path is very big. The emissions gap report calculates that it's about 10 billion tons between the NDCs and the 2-degree pathway, and almost 30 billion tons, so which is 3/4 of the global emissions for 2030. So it's a big, big gap. And this is, of course, the key challenge that we need to address now in the next couple of years. With regard to the coal, cash, cars and trees, the UK did achieve well on 2 of those ideals. So the coal power phase out, there they were really good. They managed to get all the international institutions to end financing of coal power abroad, even mainland China, which again was not expected. Then various large nations, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Poland, with big coal power plant fleet, have formally stated they want to phase out coal, which is good. Of course, one needs to see how quickly it is done. But there was one very concrete announcement that South Africa would receive $8.5 billion for a just energy transition. So if that works, then it can be a blueprint for other countries. And also we had various countries firmly committing they would not build any new coal power plants, and Vietnam had big expansion plans for coal. So that is a very good declaration. With regard to the methane pledge, also over 100 countries signed up to a 30% methane reduction, which is relevant. And this is underpinned also by a high pledge of funding from foundations, almost 1/3 billion. What was less impressive was the zero emission transport, because all the big car producing countries didn't sign up to that one. And on forest and land use, there is a nicely sounding declaration of halting and reversing deforestation by 2030. But yeah, what does it mean, halt and reverse? At current level, so the wording is so vague that, of course, almost all countries have signed up to it, but it doesn't really mean a lot in my view. Now getting into the decisions of the conference. The media and, well, TV, newspapers, they spoke a lot about these so-called cover decisions, which essentially are not really binding decisions, but just statements of intent. So I was a bit surprised how strongly the media were saying yes, and there was a big disappointment at the COP because the coal power subsidy language was watered down by India and China. Well, that was, of course, brinkmanship by the last plenary, because normally if you reopen the text, it will fall as a whole. So UK did a good job in saving the text, and also, of course, all the underlying rule decisions. But I think it doesn't matter so much whether you now talk about phase out or phase down of coal subsidies, especially given that there was never a target date for this. Now the real decisions were about the Paris Rulebook, so the Article 6, the international market mechanisms. So there are 3 types of international cooperation, 2 market mechanisms under the Article 6.2, which allows bilateral cooperative approaches that are only subject to guidance. So it means there's no international body making specific rules for this. There are only certain principles and reporting requirements on the international level. Whereas the Article 6.4 is a multilateral crediting mechanism, which is the successor of the CDM, which of course Taiwan knows quite well. And then there is the third mechanism, which is the so-called non-market approaches under 6.8. So we had 5 years of negotiations on these rules. They failed twice. So it was essentially the last chance to get this done because, also the NDC implementation is already starting, and therefore the countries need to understand how this is going to be done. And already in the year 2021, there was good constructive virtual negotiations. So given that we now have the rules, we can rapidly implement these international carbon markets. I'll get into some detail on the Article 6.2 guidance. So we now have a very robust accounting framework. There is a need for so-called corresponding adjustment, which means double bookkeeping. So the seller country needs to increase its emission balance by the amount it sold, whereas the buyer country reduces its emission balance by the amount it bought. And there had been a lot of debate whether if countries have an NDC that only covers part of the emissions, this double bookkeeping would not have to be done for activities outside of the NDC. But now it's said for everything, this double bookkeeping is required. And there's also now a very finely tuned set of purposes of the use of these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. So they can be used either for fulfillment of NDCs, they can be used for fulfillment of other international agreements, like under the International Civil Aviation Organization, the so-called CORSIA system, or they can be used for the voluntary carbon markets. And that's, of course, now very important for Taiwan, because, I'll get into that, what it means for the Taiwanese use of such units. What was said, there could not be banking of such units between the NDC implementation periods, because some countries feared there would now be a big accumulation of such ITMOs, as we've seen in certain domestic trading schemes. What is clear is it covers both emission reductions and removals, but it does not automatically cover the avoided deforestation, which was proposed by the rainforest nations, but fortunately it didn't come through, because otherwise we would have really a big loophole for low quality credits. What it didn't do for 6.2 is introduce a tax for adaptation purposes or a cancellation of credits for so-called overall mitigation of global emissions, because that was refused categorically by the industrialized countries. What is also important is there needs to be reporting in human rights issues and the indigenous people. So, of course, the NGOs were quite happy about that. With regard to the 6.4 mechanism, the crediting mechanism, it will be governed by the supervisory body and fully, because there was previously some debate whether the host countries would have the right to set certain rules. Now it's clear the host countries can only use rules that are more stringent than those of the supervisory body. The accounting is fully aligned with Article 6.2. Again, very important, because under the 6.4, a number of developing countries said, we don't want to have the double bookkeeping, but they were overruled. There are very stringent rules for the definition of additionality of activities and also the setting of baselines that needs to be aligned with the long-term goals, which is very important because that could have jeopardized the integrity of the mechanism. And we now have an overall taxation of 7% in kind, 5% going towards the adaptation fund, and 2% being cancelled for the overall mitigation of global emissions. There will be independent grievance process, so any stakeholder who feels that an activity under Article 6.4 is problematic can submit a grievance request. And what is also now very important, that all the CDM activities that are still having an ongoing crediting period, they can transition to the new mechanism. They need approval by a certain date, and they can still apply the CDM methodologies for the next 4 years. And the credits that have been issued in the past, they can be transferred to the new mechanism if they come from projects that were formally registered after the year 2012. So one can say the transition from the CDM was highly contested is now quite lenient. And the Article 6.8, the non-market approach, there will now be a committee that oversees a work program. And one needs to see how relevant it becomes. But again, it was important because certain countries in Latin America, they would have rejected the market mechanisms if the non-market approach would not have been put up. So that means Article 6 can now really go ahead. Here you see the world map of Article 6 pilot activities. That means these will now accelerate. You see that a lot is happening in Southeast Asia, which of course is a region with strong links to Taiwan. So that means Taiwan could also engage in such pilot activities. What now, of course, is important are the participation requirements, and all they say that countries need to be the party to the Paris Agreement, they need to implement an NDC, and they need various institutional requirements for the authorization of the transfers of the ITMOs, and also having the transparency in place. The reporting infrastructure needs to be there. So that, of course, means Taiwan cannot formally participate in that. So it now needs to act through proxies. So it can now act under Article 6.22 through cancellation certificates. That would be, for example, the certificates that are being used in the voluntary carbon market. So there are various options that a party friendly to Taiwan could generate ITMOs, undertake the corresponding adjustment, the double bookkeeping. Then it cancels the ITMOs and it provides a cancellation certificate to the Taiwanese government or company that wants to show the offset credits. And the second option would be the direct cancellation. And then the Taiwanese government and entity can use the cancellation certificates as if they were ITMOs. So it's fairly simple. With regard to 6.4, it would first need, of course, a party that is having activities under 6.4, for which the 6.4 emission reductions are issued. And then afterwards, it would do the same process as outlined under 6.2. The importance is that Article 6.4 requires less capacity on the side of the host country, because there will be, for example, a registry under the UNFCCC, and of course there will be the validation verification under the UNFCCC. So the whole project and activity cycle is easier to manage. And of course the small island states that are friendly to Taiwan may prefer to go through Article 6.4. Now, an important second decision was made in the context of transparency. So parties, developing countries that have capacity constraints can now invoke flexibility within the tables. So they have certain notation keys. It's clear that funding will be forthcoming from the Global Environment Facility for developing countries. What is very important is that all these tables are mandatory for all parties, because some developing countries had said there needs to be 2 sets of tables. That's not the case. Then what we have is that the IPCC inventory guidelines, the 2006 guidelines are mandatory, but the recent refinement is only voluntary. I find this problematic because it means you'll always have to renegotiate the update of the inventory guidelines. They are not automatic. What is very important is that the compliance committee can engage when there are significant and persistent inconsistencies. So it means if countries report in the wrong way over various periods, there can be a compliance procedure on those countries. Of course, there are no teeth, there are no sanctions, but still, it's good that at least the link is made. With regard to the common timeframes, that had been really an issue that went around in circles. The outcome now is quite pragmatic. So there is now a definition of end dates of NDC. So there needs to be an NDC with an end date of 2035 that is sent to the UNFCCC in 2025, so a 10-year period, but end dates will then follow in 5-year periods. So it is de facto a 5-year time frame, but with 10-year periods of the NDCs, and there is an overlap in the NDC periods. And this overlap will, of course, generate some issues, for example, with regard to the carbon markets. So do you have 2 streams of carbon markets, one for an old NDC and one for a new NDC, because they run in parallel? So this needs to be thrashed out, and I think that will generate a bit of problems now in the negotiations and the fine-tuning, but I think it can be managed eventually. With regard to the long-term finance, developing countries, of course, were angry that less than $80 billion of financing had been provided by 2019, and of course, not much more in 2020. The numbers are not yet there, maybe even less. So they said there needs to be an increase, and the industrialized countries said, we will try to give you the 100 billion by 2023 and exceed them significantly by 2025. But there is a lack of trust, a bit, Arne needs to say. With regard to the new finance goal, the negotiations are now specified in a good institutional setting. There will be an ad hoc working group, which was also the case for the Paris Agreement. There was an ad hoc working group for the Paris Agreement, so now an ad hoc group for the post-2025 collective quantified goal on climate finance. That will meet 4 times a year, so intense process. And they already specified what should be the elements of the goal. So to define a quantity in terms of money, the quality, what type of money will be given, the scope, from whom does it come, then the access features, how can one get the money. So overall, I would say it's a good start. Of course, there were various developing countries calling for huge amounts of money. The industrialized countries said, we don't talk about the amounts yet. And there is a deadline. 2024, the negotiations should be finished. So overall, a good process. What was criticized by many was on loss and damage. There was no willingness of industrialized countries to finance, but there is now a dialogue to discuss arrangements for the funding, and a few subnational governments gave a few million, but not so much. On adaptation, we now have also a 2-year process with 4 meetings per year for defining the goal more clearly, methodologies, metrics, and so it will become quite interesting. With regard to adaptation finance, there is now over $800 million were given by industrialized countries to the Adaptation Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund. And there is now a statement that industrialized countries should at least double their adaptation funding between 2019 and 2025. And then there are announcements that the International Monetary Fund wants to set up a huge fund with 50 billion. I wonder where they come from. That's not clear, but at least the statement has been done. Now, how did the media react on all this? Well, the local media were relieved. The international media focused too much on this coal subsidy issue. And the headline I like most is the New York Times, which says there is a deal, but still there's a lot that needs to be done. So to sum up, where are the key messages? So we have a firm basis for delivering on the Paris Agreement with detailed reporting requirements for all countries, with robust rules for international carbon markets, with a clear 5-year NDC ambition cycle and more urgency. We have got pledges for more climate finance, but the trust in keeping the promises is still low, and the problem that there was no willingness to engage on loss and damage, that is poisonous potentially. We saw an increased long-term ambition, and we saw that all the statements focused on 1.5 degrees, and 2 degrees seems to be almost forgotten. Well, it's, of course, let's see how it plays out in the next decades. There is unprecedented language on fossil fuels in this summary decision, despite all the debate about phase out and phase down. So overall, the short-term emission gap is the key challenge that remains, but it will get smaller. So what will happen now? We'll get the rapid start of Article 6 and CDM transition in the next 2 years. We'll have a COP in Egypt next November, which will focus on adaptation and loss and damage. We then have the following COP in the United Arab Emirates, which will focus on the global stocktake. And then we'll get a finance COP somewhere in Eastern Europe. I hope it will not be Poland, because Poland is not a good host country. I hope that the EU Commission will subsidize another country to do a really good finance COP in 2024. So with that, I would like to thank you. And of course, now I am looking forward to the discussion that we'll have together.